Hey, Blanca, thanks for taking the time today. Um, so I was thinking about how to kick this off or start this off, and maybe it helps for you to like introduce yourself a little bit, your background, how you got involved in accounts payable as well. I always find that a pretty interesting story.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So now my name is Blanca McGrory, and I have been in the finance world for as long as I can remember. Although in the beginning of my career, I didn't necessarily think I was going to be the AP guru or if that was going to be my specialty. I mean, I don't know. I think, like sometimes life has a funny way of taking its course. But yeah, I think just kind of one thing led to another, one opportunity led to another. I think sometimes in terms of the companies that I joined, that was just kind of, a great opportunity. And I think eventually with all of these, like automation and the projects and the initiatives that I have gone involved with, it kind of like sound very interesting, very challenging. So I think for me, that sort of has been the course. And I think I've enjoyed it. Like there are days when you're sort of, you feel like you're kind of, on fire, or just putting out fires here and there. But I think I see the value that it has in the company, and how you're kind of, at the hub. Like I always think that AP is at the intersection of, like finance, technology, your business operations. So yeah, I've always found the issues that we're dealing with are quite interesting, and there's no kind of day that's similar from another. You're always looking at different challenging issues, and yeah, like I've sort of quite enjoyed that over the years.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed the challenges. You do seem to touch a lot of different departments, right? You're
Mhm.
doesn't matter who in the company, what role you're doing. Ultimately, bills have to get paid for those different roles,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
so you find yourself interacting with all kinds of people around the company, and it's interesting to learn about what they're doing, right? Like
Mhm.
you're trying to solve their problem, but you're like, wow, I didn't even know we had a place out there. And those are
Right.
things you don't always, I guess, when you're in your silo, you don't get experience with or typically get involved with. But in payables, as you're having to touch all those pieces, it's you get a
Mhm.
lot of information, you see a lot of how things work. um you mentioned the mundane, not mundane, you mentioned hair on fire, but you said there's always new challenges every day, but one of the big challenges I always found was like the month end close, and like how that was, to me, that wasn't, I won't call it mundane, but it was always like what triggered kind of the fires, right?
Right.
'Cause
Yeah.
there's a couple fires you have, especially if like something cuts off your power. But
Mhm.
how is your interaction with month end closed? I know you've dealt with that in different orgs, even public and private, and there's different sectors. Are those,
Right.
does that change? How does that impact?
Yeah, so a bit of my background. I have worked in both private and public companies. And yeah, like definitely, especially for private organizations, month end is always very rigorous. You kind of have to, okay, you have a 5 day window to close the books. So it's always been very like strict, so to say. And of course, with AP, like that's always one of the first the groups to have like your first deadline, because otherwise they can't do anything. And that's what I was saying. The interesting thing about accounts payable is the data starts with accounts payable. Like like it's either expenses or revenues. You don't have anything else, right? And I'm finding definitely now that I am in the public sector, the month end is not necessarily as important as I was when I was in the in the private sector, especially when I was working for like publicly traded companies, right? Because even those ones, they're even more strict because you have to file your quarterlies with the SEC. So definitely for AP, it's a bit hectic. Those are the kind of, like the two words that you don't necessarily want to hear is a month end, because now you've got to overtimes. You got to put in those invoices as much as you can. And, like back in the, paper driven days, you got to make sure that you've got copies of those invoices, because now you've got to accrue. You've got to be able to capture those costs and include it in the financial reporting. So it's definitely, it gets quite hectic. And it's definitely, as an accountant, because I'm an accountant by trade, as an accountant, month end is not your favorite time of the month. Yeah, it's like you've embraced it because that's like the career that you have chosen, but definitely it's not your favorite time of the month.
Yeah, yeah, it's a bad word a little bit. Do
It's
you,
yeah.
you mentioned, back in the all day with the tracking down the paper invoices and like going to accrual or key, I think of like having to key those in and like burning the midnight oil on Friday night. Did you see, because you mentioned all these automation projects, have you seen your team not have to do that as much? Like in my past, it was like get everything keyed in and we were trying to get it all so in by 5 o'clock so we could go home on time on Friday. But then Saturday or Sunday, like one of us was in the office to trigger close in the ERP. So then we could actually do financials on Monday. Like that was always a lot of work. And as time went on, we could add more automation and we could trigger things remotely. And so suddenly, I wasn't in the office on a Saturday or Sunday once a month,
Yeah.
or I could trigger it at least remotely, which was a great thing to do. But do you see that same trend, or are you still having to come in on month end? What do you see there?
Not necessarily, and definitely the kind of like the automation world helped out with all of that over time with having to keep track. Because I remember the days now that you've kind of mentioned it. I remember the days when we have folder after folder for okay, like this file goes to like the this department or this manager, and then you've got another file folder for this other person, and of course it could be buried somewhere in their desk, and now you have to like make copies again for those same invoices, only like you've got like multiple copies of invoices like floating around somewhere. And as an AP, again, for your month end purposes or for payment purposes, like you keeping track of it. You're keeping your own folders. You're keeping, like multiple copies of invoices. And the other thing, back in the days, your one of your other best friends would be Excel, because now you kind of have to keep track of it in Excel for accrual purposes. You kind of, calculate everything in Excel. But yeah, like definitely, I have been pretty much in the paperless world now for, like a few years. And that is one thing that I definitely do not miss. Like I remember, like I mean, that we were a client of Medius Flow back in the days, and that was kind of like that one is my first foray, or maybe a pleasant foray into kind of the automation world. And what I find really really pleasant is that yeah, like come around month end, you can spit out your data, you can run data, and then do more analytics rather than shuffling of paper or chasing people for those lost invoices. So there's still work that AP does at month end, but now it has shifted into more analytics, and I find that it's a lot more value driven than again this kind of flipping and shuffling papers back and forth. So that's
Yeah,
one of the great things.
it is a big thing. Like and I want to ask a question about some of the initiatives in a minute, but one of the big things I've noticed or I've seen, and I've managed quite a few AP teams and then worked with countless others as they go through the transformation, is like, when especially if you're coming from a full paper area, but even if you're coming from like sort of digitized, which is a lot of companies right now, like they've digitized a very standard, like a very manual process. And they're like, well, at least we went paperless, right?
Yeah.
Especially during COVID, everybody was like, I have to
Mm-hmm.
get rid of paper.
Yeah.
But uh, what I found is if you can really put in some thought into changing that whole process, meaning going from, a full manual or heavy touch point process to a fully automated or where you're only reviewing exceptions. And that allows your team to go from, okay, now I'm just lining up my three pieces of paper to put it into the paper context to now doing more analyst work or more getting ahead of the curve to where it's like, okay, this one supplier is always my price issue or my receiving issue. And so now you can start preventing that from happening next time. I know once I found myself like counting rugs in a warehouse because I was like, "You are not shipping them," and they're like, "No, we are." So focusing on the actual issue and getting ahead of it is something your team can do one as you put in the different softwares and the different automation processes. And in my opinion, a lot of it does need kind of a step back. So I know you've been successful in doing that in more than one case, but it's like, how do you separate yourself from, okay, I need to get an invoice from point A to point B, and here's all my manual processes. How do you kind of look at that without following that same path, right? How do I say, okay, what's the most automated process? And sometimes for organizations, I find that hard. Have you experienced that, like coming in and saying, let's reinvent the entire process? And do you meet resistance to that?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that, any change you make you'll always find resistance somewhere, whether it be because of, like budgets, or whether it be because people are just used to doing their own thing the same old way, or people are not necessarily receptive to, like, especially technology, right? Like I'm now at a kind of point where I'm working with like different demographics, so they have different types of skill set, different concerns. I'm working, or I'm working in a place where it's like more unionized. So again, private versus public environment, they're all very different. But in terms of, like, how do I come in and look at a kind of, like what the, I guess, the current landscape is, and figure out, like, what are we going to do? What can we do? And usually in terms of, like, my team, what I always say is, like, is there, like, where do you feel like there is a problem? Like, is this something that you would like to do every day? So, flipping paper back and forth, is that something that you actually enjoy doing? Because if the answer is no, then we need to find a solution, right? Like, do you feel like your 9 to 5 can be better spent doing something else? And if the answer is yes, then we definitely have to look for something. And so when we're looking at, like, vendors and process and invoices, yeah, we like I look at where do we find, where do we spend the most of our time doing, and how much value are we getting in that, and then you can kind of, gauge in terms of what other options are available for you, whether it be, oh, let's maybe this types of invoices, these types of vendors, we can do an upload, right? It's not automated. It's kind of, like, semi-automated, but in the grand scale of the automation now, like, that's kind of like a very mom and pop, right? But those are the things that we can do. I mean, when we say, okay, well, I guess for AP, traditionally, we've always been looked at as like a back end process, a data entry kind of person, right? And really, back in the days, that would be probably, at the very least, is 80% of your job is data entry. And so now what options are there to reduce that or to eliminate that. And so here comes OCR, here comes like machine learning. So those are the things. I mean, there's so much offering now in the market that you can avail, but it's up to you to kind of like decide, okay, and assess your process. Where is my bottleneck? Where am I spending the most time and getting the littlest value? And then figure out kind of, how you want to address that, what solutions there are for you.
I think I think you put it really well. Like, is this what you want to do when you're 9 to 5? And if the answer is no, how do we change that? Right. And that's seems so simple, but a lot of times you get so stuck into just trying to keep up with, hey, I've got a disconnect or a past due notice or, late payments, whatever it is that you're trying to keep up with, in that role, you can lose track of what your ultimate goal is. Now, something that maybe, and this goes towards, you mentioned things that everything's offered. There's so much out there now. And I've been on both sides, right? I work on the software side now. I get to build it, but I've also been on the other side where I'm trying to weed through all the various solutions out there. Sometimes they all sound the same. Sometimes they make wild claims that you're just kind of rolling your eyes out. Have you found any way to kind of weed through that, or do you approach looking at systems like you define something beforehand and then go to market asking for it? Or are you on the other side where you do some research and say, oh, I hadn't thought of that? Like, how do you weed through all the, like, tell what's marketing and what's not marketing as
Yeah,
you're going
I
through the
definitely have
process?
been on both sides of the equation.
Uh-huh.
I mean, I think, at this stage, I've gone through kind of, different RFPs, like, that process. I remember when I kind of, first look into automating something, again, you identify, yeah, we have a problem. What what can we do about it, and what are the different options out there? And like, you ask for demos, you look at the software, you look at their current customers to see what
Hmm.
their feedback is going to be. But I think, after some time, after kind of doing this, like, at least a couple of times, you learn a lot better to, yeah, like, to ask the right questions that are relevant to you, and that way you're not necessarily just getting a sales pitch, right? Because, yeah, like, I mean, we've gone through kind of like different projects where, come around implementation time, like, whoa, this is not what we talked about, this is not what you have promised. And so it really creates a big setback into that development of that project, right? But yeah, I think asking the right questions. But I think also the one important thing that you really need to do, and I always say this before any implementation of kind, whether it be AP or whether it be anything else, is you need to know your current landscape. You need to know your processes. What is it that you are trying to solve? Because, like you said, there's a gargantuan amount of solutions out there, and they all look, I mean, especially if you're in a paper-based world, anything is better than paper-based, right?
Yeah.
But is it going to hit the mark? Is it going to address maybe 8 out of your 10 other problems, rather than just being going from paper-based to paperless, right? Because you have to know your current landscape and figure out what really is important to you. So, creating like a bit of a roadmap, and, maybe qualifications. Like,
Hmm.
how are you assessing these softwares? What is important to you? Is it just, like, if your biggest problem right now is, like, three-way matching, for example? how does this address three-way matching? Or how does this address, like, say, if you have a lot of your invoices are still coming as, like handwritten, well, is their OCR solution going to capture the data on the invoice? Because if it's not, then you're back to being paper-based, which is, like completely,
Didn't solve your
counterproductive.
problem.
Exactly, right? So yeah, so I think that first is you have to know your current landscape. You have to know what it is that you want. And when you're talking to the vendors, you have to ask the right questions. You kind of like, okay, this is my situation. Demonstrate to me how you are going to do this. Even your, people's ERP systems are different. I've worked with, like many ERP solutions, they all behave differently. The way they do the three-way matching is going to be different. So how is that going to integrate and interact with your new solution? Are you just kind of like layering another like problem with whatever it is that you have right now? Because that's sort of like another, I think another piece that I have experienced in kind of different organizations is they have different solutions that are meant to talk to each other but are still very disjointed, right? So now if you're going to bring in another one, like how is that going to interact with an already disjointed bunch of solutions?
You bring up a good point. The disjointed solutions often are founded because the one company bought another, and then like, hey, they match together, but then how engineered are they? Like those are definitely things to ask. I've
Exactly.
found like as you're going through it, um, oh, this all sounds great, but let's get into some of the details. What's the problem I'm solving? And even walk through some of those business use cases with them. Like, let's make sure we all have a good understanding of what the desired outcome is. Um, that and I've the educating yourself is a hard part because it's on one side what your issue is and you've defined it, but then sometimes you're like, I don't know how people are solving this. And I think I've told this story to somebody before, but once I was calling around because I knew my problem, and I called around to a couple major solutions and talked to them. And one of them, like within 2 weeks, they show up at my door. They're like, "Hey, we want to walk through a demo." I'm like, I'm not right. Like they told me they were coming. They were in town. Um, but they weren't like, they didn't understand what I was really asking. And then we all sit down and I'm like, okay, let's talk about what I'm trying to solve. And then there was an actual engineer there who was like, oh, well, we need you to do XYZ as well. I was like, yeah, like I could have saved you a trip.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
all I was trying to do was educate myself on this first before we went through this whole process. And that was like a 10-minute conversation that finished that whole opportunity for that one company. And so that's a challenging landscape to get through because I actually know they have a really good solution. It just didn't fit for what I needed. And I was trying to see like what they offered. And so like because of those things, you end up, I don't know, I found myself using websites a lot more before I started reaching out to people. So there's a balance though. At some point you have to reach out and it's like narrowing down um, and weeding through all that. I've found sometimes challenging in the past, but like the webinars help too. I don't know if you attend those. Those usually give you a pretty good feeling on overall competency, maybe is the right word for it,
Mhm.
of what they're actually doing versus what the website can convey. Um, with that, uh, trying to think, maybe I'll keep on the tech process for a minute. So AI has become like the top on everybody's tech. Everything has AI in it. I've I know I've got a one of our top customers has even like their own vibe coding platform for all of their
All
existing
right.
their employees can go through and they can just build that stuff out and try it. You like what do you see? Do you see appetite to try those things out? Are policies really locked down? Because I see that too. Like I see on the other side, people are like, no, I don't trust it. Where do you see it in, and even into payables, like making way?
Yeah, I mean, AI is definitely the buzz sexy word these days. And everybody kind of thinks that, oh, yeah, like AI is going to solve my everything. But, of course it doesn't, right? Like, people, like to me, AI does not replace the people relationships, the actual human intellect decision making. Like, it does not replace that at all. However, do I do I love it? Absolutely. I think that given the right situation, if you put it in the right use, it can definitely help you in your day to day. Like, those everyday mundane things that does not necessarily need that human intellect to decide. Definitely, you can rely on AI to be able to do those for you, and as a result, you can then focus on what I always say is like the value added activities. Focus on your vendor management, on your exception resolutions, fraud prevention, right? Like those are kind of big things nowadays, and I think especially with and that's sort of the balance. AI can really help you, and it can be like your friend one day, but then again, with the increased use of AI, there's also that increased risk for fraud, right? So you got to be able to balance and be able to use that smartly. So yeah, but I think so for us. I mean, like I said, I've been involved in different project implementations, technology kind of initiatives, and a lot of them have used AI kind of, whether, it's like a whether it's just partial or kind of, I've seen some that are kind of, they have the generative, the agentic AI, which is like really cool if you're kind of, like in that world. But, just in terms of creating that efficiency for you, like the data capture and being able to like suggest how your costs are going to be allocated, things like that, being able to kind of map that out against your policies, so now you have another like help in again enforcing your policy or finding the exceptions. And if your policy is tight enough, yeah, avoid those frauds and errors that could easily be missed with like just a human eye.
Yeah, I think it is. I think, would you say it's the sexy word right now? It is everywhere. One, there's a lot of benefits behind it. One of the challenging pieces I see is those controls. And then, like, say somebody goes and vibe codes an app to process things. When you start looking at, like, here in the US, like SOX controls or just in general finance controls, like, you can't just say one thing went from one end to another without having full audit trails. Or then if I'm dealing with restricted data, especially when you're in healthcare or government work, a lot of times there's very strong controls around that. I can't just have something that's kind of behind the curtain. So you need something with controls, but that can also leverage all of that intelligence. And like you said a couple times about, it's about getting the data in. Like the data really makes a big difference to your AI. If you can capture more, it allows you to train the machine learning. But it's also something that, as I've seen AP grow over the last 20 years, it also helps influence the business, because now it's not just a single line. Like maybe on the GL, it's a single line, but now I can pull open my AP system and see, oh, hey, this head of lettuce has increased over, like you can get to the details without having to have over engineered your ERP to calculate all of those line item costs, even on things that are non PO, right? Which is great. So suddenly I've got access to this data and I can make those decisions early on um, that impact the business, which is always, I think, the more fun part than,
Yes.
just going in and clicking pay.
Right. Yeah.
Oversimplifying, of course.
Mhm.
Um, so with with that being said, maybe what is your I know we're kind of running towards the end of our time here, but maybe to wrap things up, what is your top priorities now? Like, what are you working on to make a big change? Or where do you see things changing soon? Like, is it in software? Is it in process? Is it in controls and prevention? Like, where do you see things having to be? Where's your
I,
focus?
I think for me, there's still a part of me where I want to promote AP as not just the traditional back-end processors, but be able to see accounts payable as an actual strategic business partner. In terms of being able to make decisions for the business, creating a cash flow strategy, tightening your stakeholders, your vendor relationships. I think that AP should be front and center in those types of things. So that's one. The other thing also is in terms of our developing our accounts payable professionals, right? Like I think again, traditionally we're seen as data entry people, but now I want them to be more data driven. I want them to be seen as, I want them to focus more on the analytics side. And again, focus on value added activities like the vendor management, the controls and risk mitigation, fraud prevention, and being able to develop the skills to kind of move them from here to that next level. Because AP is, while it's still, very much it could be an entry level position, but it's no longer that. If you're going to compete with like AI and all of these onset of technologies, you need to have the proper skill set, and it's not even just like Excel, right? We have BI and like a business warehouse, being able to mine that data and really make sense of them all. Also providing a better customer service, supplier, stakeholder experience, because I think it's through that experience that you're able to create those relationships. If you have better relationships with your vendors, you'll get preferential treatment, preferable terms. If you take care of them, they'll take care of you, right? And again, any type of relationship, it moves the business forward, and you'll need that. And again, the risk management and controls. We talked about how AI is doing all sorts of fun things, but it can also be harmless if you don't put the proper controls. So I think for me, I always like partnering with our internal audit. So if you've got one, leverage them, because again, they can help you mine that data and kind of you just figure out, like, help you assess your processes so that they are so you've set up your proper controls in place, right? Because there's no point of changing your processes or changing the technology when you've got a bunch of gaps that put the business at risk.
Yeah, the last thing you want is internal audit knocking at your door asking why
Exactly.
why you haven't followed that, or worst case, external.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah. Yeah,
the
lucky for me, actually, I've worked in internal audit before as well. So, and these are the exact same processes that I was auditing when I was on the other side. So I know kind of, in the audit lens, yeah, like what kinds
yeah,
of stuff do we need to put in place?
yeah. Some of us have learned those the hard way, certainly.
Exactly. Hmm.
The you were bringing up the growth of the payables team, and I agree. I think historically it was seen, and it was always a very good stable place to go in the company. Right, you could get there, you could work from 9 to 5. It was a very stable job, but the role has grown and changed so much. One of the things, and there's actually an article out on the AP Institute that I have out there about how I've actually worked to rebrand in my past in different orgs, like to change it from just accounts payable to like accounting operations. And to me, I felt like that covered more things because my teams went from, like being in invoices and marrying up the receiver to the PO, like all very manual, to suddenly now doing month end close and accruals and balancing, going through the books and actually like helping us close things or even do some reconciliations, right? And then I found that also helped me recruit in new, like fresh college grads. Like you mentioned, it could be an entry level role, but I could bring in maybe some people who, hey, we need to feed in also our just full blown accounting team, right? Recruiting has become harder and harder, I feel like, especially in accounting. And so having people have stepping stones while they're earning their CPA or other roles has been very beneficial. So, rebranding accounts payable, because I do think it's not just paying now, right? You're not just putting those invoices in. Um, so I know we're at time. Maybe last question, and then we can wrap things up. Is what would you say in your payables? Because I'll limit it to payables. Has been your biggest maybe accomplishment or change in your career so far?
Dear, that's a loaded question. I think it's always being able to create that change within organization, within the people. I mean, I guess I've been in a leadership role for a while now, and I always say that when you're in a leadership role, you're now responsible for people. You're responsible for people's lives, their future, whatever, right? And like especially when you have fresh grads coming in, well, they've got a whole career in front of them. Um, and I think I kind of, like take pride knowing about people who actually, like, people in my past who've reached out to me and said, hey, Blanca, remember that time when we had this conversation? It really kind of, sparked a plug in me. And like that weekend, I did this and I did that. And now I've, it's opened up a lot of opportunities for me. And I didn't really think, to me, it was kind of, when I was doing that, well, it's kind of a part of your everyday. You're supposed to do one-on-ones. You're supposed to direct them. You're supposed to do performance reviews and kind of, tell them, okay, these are your goals for next year and so on. And it started out to be kind of a task that you do as a manager. But I think over time, also as I look at my leadership journey of where I was and where I am now, I actually take that to heart a fair bit because I know of like the opportunities there are like in accounts payable. Like I actually really think that within accounts payable, it's actually a really really good starting point because you know how numbers get into your financials. You know where that's coming from. You know the things that should be in place for an invoice to be paid, for an invoice to be recognized as this or that, and so on. So it's a really, really good starting point. But I like instilling in people, okay, so what what happens from here on? what is it that you'd like to do? Would you like to, just keep paying invoices or something else? Like, I always say that, in a management role, it's not an exact science. Like hiring is not always an exact science. But once you have the people, you need, in fairness to them, you need to be able to kind of, assess, okay, what where are they in their journey, and how can I affect you? And whether it's something like, oh, yes, I really love accounts payable and I can see myself going into accounting. Well, let's get you set up to get your designation. Or it could be like, okay, I like this part of accounts payable, but I think I like the AI part. I like the technology and so on. Well, okay, let's get you set up with maybe more technology courses. Or maybe I just like, we set up this project in AP and I find like I really like being involved in projects. Well, maybe you could be a project manager. So I think that, it's not necessarily accounts payable, but that's sort of like that's where my journey has been, because like you said, a lot of people who started in accounts payable are, like young, fresh grads, or maybe, somebody who's kind of, retiring. But for me, it's like, okay, your goal is to retire in 3 years. How can we make that the best 3 years of your journey? So
Yeah.
those are kind of, the questions. Because I think for me, in any organization, the people is the most important things. Like it makes me a bit teary, kind of, talking about, like people. But I think that's the most important thing, because business is business, right? And whichever business you come in, an invoice is an invoice. It's all the same thing. But what matters to me most is the people. Like how can you affect them? How can you, like, within AP, how can you make this a little bit more exciting for them, so that they're a little bit more engaged, right?
Yeah, it's incredibly rewarding. And it's also, you brought up a good point too. Like you can step into an org where somebody may have been in that role for 15 years, 10 years, at least, in the payables role there. And you're like, hey, how do we help you grow? And then to see them come in and grow or suddenly look at things completely different. Like, hey, I used to like lick envelopes and stuff checks. And you're like, why are we even stuffing checks? Let's start there. But
Mm-hmm.
to see them grow into now suddenly looking at, how to make the roles, their, just progress in their careers or themselves. Yeah, it's very rewarding. Well, that being said, I appreciate your time, Wonka. Thank you so much, and
Yeah, no
we'll chat
problem.
soon. All right,
Yeah,
thank
for
you.
sure. Thank you. Bye
Thanks.
bye.
Bye bye.